I never thought the farm would be mine. Not like this. The last time I saw my grandfather alive, he gripped my wrist with the kind of strength you don't forget. His voice, cracked and weak, still had that stubborn weight I grew up with. "Jack, the animals, the land, they're yours now, but promise me you'll follow the rules." I thought he was rambling, just the fever of a dying old man. Now, standing at the edge of the dusty driveway, the house rising in front of me like a monument to everything he built, I'm not so sure anymore. The funeral was earlier that morning, a simple ceremony, barely a dozen people. My father stood there, stiff and uncomfortable in a black suit he probably hadn't worn since my parents' wedding. He didn't shed a tear. He never cared about the farm, never cared about animals or the soil, or even about the man who raised him. It was always me who loved this place. Even as a kid, I spent summers here, helping feed the cattle, running with the dog, watching my grandfather move through the fields like he was part of them. And now it's just me. The gravel crunches under my boots as I take the first steps toward the farmhouse porch. The boards creak in the same familiar way. The door groans when I push it open, and the smell hits me. Wood, hay, and something faintly sour, like old leather. Memories flood back. Mornings with eggs and bacon, evenings with stories by the fireplace. The smell of tobacco smoke curling into the beams above. It should feel comforting, but instead it feels hollow. I drop my bag by the doorway and stand in the living room. The silence is deafening. No radio playing in the kitchen, no cough from the old armchair. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing against me like the house itself is holding its breath. On the table lies a worn leather notebook. My stomach knots the second I see it. It's the same one my grandfather pressed into my hand in the hospital. The pages are yellowed, the cover scarred and soft from decades of use. On the front, in his shaky handwriting, are the words, "The rules." I run my fingers over the letters. My chest tightens. I almost laugh, but the sound dies in my throat. I flip it open. The first line is written in bold strokes, as if carved into the page. Never feed them after dark. The next, if you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. And then, do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. The rest of the list is smudged, faded, barely legible. But those first three, they're sharp, almost burned into the paper. I close the book. My pulse is faster than it should be. It's stupid. These are just the ramblings of a dying man. Folklore, old farmer paranoia. Still, I put the notebook in my jacket pocket. That night, after unpacking just enough to claim the guest room as my own, I step outside. The air is cool, the sky smeared with stars. The fields stretch out into the distance, and beyond them, the forest looms like a dark wall. I remember running toward those trees as a kid, only to hear my grandfather's sharp whistle calling me back. "Never too close, Jack." Not the woods. The barn dog, a mutt named Rusty, trots up to me, tail wagging. He's older now, but his eyes shine with recognition. I kneel to scratch his ears, and he presses his head against me, whining softly. "Miss the old man too, huh?" I whisper. My watch says 9:47 p.m. Not too late, but the sun is gone. Darkness spreads across the farm, swallowing the fields one shadow at a time. Rusty paws at his empty bowl near the barn door. I hesitate. Never feed them after dark. I shake my head. "Come on, boy. You need to eat." I scoop kibble into his bowl, the sound loud in the still night. Rusty digs in, crunching happily. I lean against the barn wall, suddenly aware of how quiet everything is. No insects, no distant frogs, just the scrape of teeth against metal. And then, whistling. Soft, faint, carried by the wind from the direction of the woods. My blood goes cold. I freeze, every hair on my body rising. It's too clear, too human to be the wind. A simple tune, slow and drawn out, floating across the fields. Rusty stops eating. His head jerks up, ears stiff, eyes fixed on the tree line. A low growl rumbles in his throat. The notebook's words echo in my mind. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. But I'm standing outside, in the dark, bowl empty at my feet. And the whistling grows louder. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whistling grew louder, drifting from the direction of the woods, each note deliberate, stretched, as if whoever or whatever was making it knew I was listening. Rusty's growl deepened until his whole body trembled, his teeth glinting in the faint light. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the sound faded. The silence that followed was worse. Heart pounding, I grabbed Rusty's collar and pulled him toward the house. We stumbled across the yard, the night air heavy and cold, the shadows pressing too close. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and stood in the hallway with my back against the wood, every nerve screaming. Rusty barked once, sharp and panicked, then fell silent, pacing the floorboards like a soldier on patrol. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I kept hearing phantom creaks, faint echoes of the tune circling my skull. When I finally did drift off, it was restless, shallow, haunted by half-formed nightmares. When morning broke, the sunlight spilling through the curtains felt unreal, fragile, like a dream that could vanish the moment I blinked. I forced myself out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath my feet. The house smelled of dust and cedar. Everything here was his, every mug in the cupboard, every nail in the wall. It felt like walking through a memory. I wandered into the kitchen. The old clock ticked too loudly. On the counter sat the chipped coffee pot I remembered from summers long ago. I could almost hear his gruff voice behind me. "Never start your day without coffee, boy. The animals can wait 1 minute." My chest tightened. For a moment, I swore I felt him there, the scrape of his chair, the rustle of his newspaper. But it was only me, standing in an empty kitchen with ghosts that smelled like tobacco and motor oil. After a quick breakfast, I stepped outside. The morning air was sharp, fresh, and full of dew. The fields stretched endlessly, and the barn stood tall, weathered but stubborn, just like he always was. Rusty trotted beside me, tail wagging, his paws damp from the grass. The farm looked smaller than I remembered. When I was a kid, it felt like the whole world, an empire of fields, hay bales, and long summer evenings. I remembered chasing chickens until he yelled, pretending the cows were dragons, building forts in the hayloft. He always pretended to be annoyed, but his eyes gave him away. He liked seeing me love this place. He taught me everything: how to carry a bucket without spilling, how to check a horse's hooves, how to fix a broken fence with nothing but wire and grit. He'd laugh when I struggled, then step in, showing me with his rough hands. "You got farmer's blood in you, Jack," he'd say. "Not like your father. He was born with restless feet." That always stung, even as a kid. My father hated the farm, hated the work. He left the moment he could, never looking back, but I stayed every summer, soaking it in, letting the soil stain my hands. I was the son my grandfather never truly had. Now, walking through the empty fields, I felt the weight of that inheritance pressing on me. Not just the soil and the barn, but the notebook in my jacket pocket. The rules. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. The words burned in my mind. I pushed the thought aside and started my chores. The animals greeted me with wary eyes, cattle shifting in their stalls, chickens fluttering nervously, Rusty pacing at my heels. Everything looked normal in the daylight, but there was a tension in the air, a stiffness in the way they moved. As I scattered feed for the chickens, a memory came back, sharp as broken glass. I was maybe 10 years old, running across the yard with a bucket almost too heavy for me. I dropped it, spilling grain across the ground. By the time I scrambled to gather it, the sun had slipped low, shadows stretching long across the dirt. My grandfather's hand clamped down on my shoulder so hard it hurt. "Not after dark," he snapped, dragging me inside. His eyes were wild, darting to the tree line. I tried to ask why, but he only muttered, "Rules keep us safe." That night, I thought I heard something moving outside. The next morning, he never mentioned it again. Now, standing here as an adult, I realized he wasn't just strict, he was afraid. I spent the afternoon fixing fences, tightening boards, brushing dust from the tack in the barn. Busy work, anything to keep me moving. Yet no matter what I did, my eyes kept sliding toward the woods. The trees swayed lazily in the breeze, but their shadows looked thicker, darker, as if the forest was watching me. When evening came, the unease only deepened. Rusty stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. I heated up some canned stew in the kitchen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. I ate fast, shoved the bowl in the sink, and walked the house like a guard making rounds. The notebook lay on the nightstand in the guest room. I flipped it open again, reading the words for the 100th time. My eyes snagged on the first rule. My stomach dropped. Last night, I already broke it. Rusty's bowl had clattered in the dark, kibble crunching between his teeth. The moment I remembered, the whistling started. Was that coincidence or consequence? The second rule stared back at me. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. But I hadn't. I was outside, in the open, exposed. If not for sheer luck, maybe I wouldn't be here to read the rule at all. Sleep came harder the second night. Every creak of the house jolted me awake. Rusty growled low in his throat, pacing at the foot of the bed. I kept the notebook under my pillow, as if that made me safer. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, whistling. Faint, distant, threading through the open cracks of the night. A soft, deliberate tune carried from the direction of the woods. My breath locked in my chest. Rusty stiffened, ears perked, body quivering. His growl was sharper this time, his teeth bared. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound lingered, then faded. Minutes passed like hours before I finally slumped back, sweat chilling my skin. When dawn broke, I stumbled outside, desperate for air. The grass was heavy with dew, and the morning sun spilled golden across the fields. But something was wrong. By the tree line, in the shadows of the forest, the grass was pressed down. Long, heavy impressions. Footprints too wide, too long, leading out of the woods, and stopping just short of the fence. Not animal, not human. Something had been there, watching, waiting, and it had come closer. I stared at the pressed-down grass until my throat went dry. Long, heavy impressions stopped just short of the fence, as if something had been watching me from the cover of the trees. Not animal, not human, something else. My heart hammered, and I stumbled back toward the house, clutching Rusty's collar. The morning sun was bright, but it didn't warm me. It only lit the place where the footprints ended, right at the border of safety. That's when his voice came back to me, the voice I'd tried not to think about, the one I'd heard in that hospital room just days ago. The smell of antiseptic and bleach hung heavy in the air. Machines beeped softly, each sound a reminder that the end was near. I sat in a stiff chair by his bed, staring at the man who had once seemed unbreakable. My grandfather. His skin was pale, stretched thin over his bones, but his eyes, those fierce, storm-colored eyes, were still alive. He turned his head slowly toward me, and his hand reached out, shaky but strong enough to catch my wrist. I felt the calluses even then, rough ridges carved by decades of work on the land. "Jack," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper. "You'll take care of the farm now." My throat closed. I nodded, unable to find words. He gave me a long look, one that carried the weight of generations, of secrets I didn't yet understand. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached under his blanket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. Its cover was cracked, the corners frayed, the spine held together with tape. "Take it," he whispered. I did. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. He coughed, his body shaking, before forcing the words out. "You follow what's in there. Every word. Don't doubt it. Don't question it." I opened the notebook then, right there in the hospital, and saw the first page. The words hit me like a punch. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. I frowned. "Grandpa, what is this? Some kind of—" "Promise me," he interrupted, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes blazed with something I'd never seen before. Not wisdom, not pride, fear. I froze. I had never seen fear in him, not once in all the summers I'd spent by his side. "Promise me, Jack." His voice cracked. "It's the only way you'll survive out there." "Survive?" I laughed nervously, glancing at the strange rules again. "You're talking like there's—" His hand squeezed tighter. "Promise!" The room was too quiet. Machines beeped steadily, indifferent to the storm in his eyes. I swallowed. "I promise." Only then did his grip loosen. His body sagged back against the bed, relief flickering across his face. He closed his eyes, whispering one last time, "The rules keep us safe." His hand slipped from mine, and just like that, the man who had been my anchor, my guide, was gone. I sat there frozen, clutching the notebook, surrounded by the sharp smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of machines that suddenly felt hollow. Back in the present, standing by the fence line, the memory hit me harder than ever. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the same notebook. The words on the first page glared at me. "Never feed them after dark." I had already broken it. "If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn." And I had failed that too. The third rule stared at me like a threat. "Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line." My stomach turned as I glanced at the pressed grass near the woods. Had they been standing there last night, watching, waiting for me to make the mistake that would finish me? Rusty whined softly at my side, pressing close to my leg. I dropped to my knees, clutching the dog's fur, grounding myself in something real. But even as I buried my fingers in his coat, my eyes drifted back to the trees. I remembered how my grandfather had sounded in those final moments. Not like a man passing on wisdom, but like a man passing on a curse. And for the first time, I began to believe that he hadn't been delirious. He had been warning me, desperately. The farm wasn't just land. It wasn't just animals and crops and fences. It was a boundary, a barrier against something that came from those woods. And now it was mine to hold. The notebook shook in my hands. My promise to him echoed in my head. I promise. But promises don't stop the shadows at the tree line. Promises don't stop the whistling in the night. I closed the notebook, shoved it back into my pocket, and stared at the forest. For the first time, I wasn't just uneasy. I was terrified. Because I knew, deep down, that whatever had haunted him his whole life was coming for me next. I closed the notebook, shoved it back into my pocket, and stared at the forest. The morning sun lit the trees in gold, but to me, they looked like a wall of shadows, hiding something that refused to show its face. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I fixed what needed fixing, carried water, checked the fences. I moved like a man on autopilot, but my mind never left the notebook or the footprints at the tree line. My grandfather had warned me. I hadn't listened. And now, for the first time, I believed every word. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the fields in amber light, my stomach tightened. Another night was coming. I ate dinner alone at the kitchen table. The house was too quiet. Every scrape of my spoon echoed against the walls. I thought about my life before this, my tiny apartment in the city, the dead-end job, the faces of co-workers I hardly knew. I had no wife, no kids, no one waiting for me. I told myself I liked the freedom, that I didn't need anyone. But sitting here, in this farmhouse filled with silence and memories, I wondered if I had only been preparing for this moment. To inherit his world, his rules, his curse. Rusty lay at my feet, ears twitching even in sleep. His body shivered with small growls he couldn't swallow down. When I finished eating, I checked the locks on every door and window. The old wood groaned as I slid the bolts into place. I found a lantern in the barn, trimmed the wick and lit it. The glow was soft, too soft, barely pushing back the shadows. I carried it room to room, trying to ignore the way the dark seemed to follow me, pressing close. By 9 o'clock, the house felt like a fortress, or maybe a prison. It started slowly. First, the animals shifted restlessly in their stalls. The cattle stamped and huffed. The horses snorted and pawed the ground. Even the chickens rustled and flapped their wings. Rusty was the worst. He wouldn't stop pacing from door to door, ears pricked, tail stiff, every muscle on edge. Then came the sounds outside. A crunch of gravel, a whisper of movement against the barn wall, the faintest scrape, like claws testing the wood. I froze in the hallway, lantern in hand, my breath shallow. The notebook's words beat in my skull like a drum. Stay inside. Don't look. Don't feed them. My grandfather must have spent decades like this, every night a battle of willpower. The minutes dragged like hours. The noises circled the house, sometimes faint, sometimes louder. Once, something brushed against the living room window. I nearly dropped the lantern. Rusty barked, a sharp, furious sound, but I shushed him, clutching his collar until he quieted. Midnight came, and then the lights went out. The lamp flickered, sputtered, then died, smoke curling up from the wick. I tapped the glass, but it was useless. The house fell into darkness, the kind that swallows everything, leaving only the silver wash of moonlight leaking through the curtains. And in that silence, a sound rose. Whistling. Not faint this time, not distant, closer. The tune was the same, slow, deliberate, haunting, but it wasn't drifting from the woods now. It was here, in the yard, steps from the front porch. Rusty pressed against me, his body rigid, his growl a low thunder in his chest. The notebook's second rule screamed inside my skull, if you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. But I wasn't in the barn. I was in the house, the wrong place, the unprotected place. The whistling grew louder, sharper, as if whoever was making it knew exactly where I was. I clutched the notebook in my pocket with one hand and Rusty's fur with the other. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then the front doorknob rattled. The doorknob rattled again. Once, twice. A slow, deliberate twist of metal, as if someone was testing it. Not trying to break in, but checking to see if I'd left it unlocked. Rusty lunged forward with a snarl, his teeth flashing in the moonlight that spilled through the window. His bark split the silence like a gunshot. But almost immediately he backed away, whining low in his throat, tail tucked. I froze in the hallway, my breath shallow, one hand gripping the wall, the other pressed tight against the notebook in my pocket. The rules echoed in my mind like scripture. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. But they weren't at the tree line anymore. They were here. The whistling rose again, so close it felt like it was inside the walls. The same tune, stretched and deliberate, the notes bending in ways no human mouth should shape. It seeped into the wood, into my bones, into the marrow of the house itself. The doorknob stopped rattling. Silence followed, a silence so deep it made the blood in my ears sound like drums. Then came footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the porch. Each board creaked under the weight. Step, whistle, step, whistle. The sound moved along the side of the house, dragging shadows with it. Rusty growled, a low rumble that vibrated against my leg. He stared at the window, hackles raised, his entire body quivering like a taut wire ready to snap. I wanted to look. God help me, I wanted to pull the curtain back just an inch, to see what was out there. Curiosity burned like fire in my veins, but the notebook's words pressed harder into my skull. Do not look into their eyes. What if that's what it wanted? The footsteps shifted again, around the side of the house, toward the kitchen. A scrape of claws, no, not claws. Nails, fingers, something dragged across the wood siding, leaving a long, splintering scratch. The whistling faltered. For one breathless moment, it stopped, and then came the knock. Soft at first. 3 gentle taps on the window pane, like a friend asking to be let in. My stomach lurched. Every part of me screamed, "Don't move." Rusty barked again, but this time it broke halfway into a whimper. The knock came again, harder, louder. My teeth clenched until my jaw ached. "Go away," I whispered, though my voice was barely sound. The whistling started again, right there against the glass, the notes vibrating through the thin pane, filling the room with their impossible melody. I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching Rusty close, both of us trembling. The air in the house grew colder, heavy with the stink of wet earth and rot. The whistle dragged on, endless, circling the house once more. Every window rattled as if something brushed against it. The sound rose and fell, sometimes fading, sometimes swelling so loud it hurt my ears. It was everywhere, all at once. And then, silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but waiting. I dared to breathe. Rusty leaned against me, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. I stroked his fur with shaking hands, trying to calm both of us. Minutes crawled by. Nothing. No whistle, no footsteps, just silence. I almost convinced myself it was over. Almost, until the glass beside me frosted white. My eyes snapped to the window. Breath. Something was breathing against the glass from the outside. The frost spread in jagged bursts, a pale handprint forming slowly, pressing into the pane. Long fingers, too long. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my throat. Rusty barked furiously, snapping at the air, but the handprint only pressed harder, the whistling rising again, so close now it vibrated inside my chest. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I stayed rooted in place, clutching the notebook like it was a holy relic, the words burning in my mind. Do not look into their eyes. So I didn't. I stared at the floor, at Rusty, at my own shaking hands. Anywhere but the window. The whistling peaked, shrill and broken, then cut off mid-note. The frost melted, the handprint faded, and just like that, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, heavy, waiting. I sank to the floor, my back against the wall, my breaths shallow gasps. Rusty pressed himself against me, whining softly, eyes still fixed on the dark window. We stayed like that until dawn. Neither of us moved, neither of us slept. The night passed in a haze of terror and silence. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I dared to lift my head. The window was clean. No frost, no handprint. Just glass reflecting the pale light of morning. But deep down I knew it hadn't been a dream. Something had been there. Something had tried to get in. And it was only the beginning. The sun rose pale and weak, as if even daylight was afraid to touch this place. I hadn't slept. Neither had Rusty. We sat frozen most of the night, pressed against the wall, listening to silence that felt like it had teeth. Now, in the morning, I forced myself outside. The grass was damp with dew, glistening like a field of broken glass. My boots squelched in the mud as I walked toward the spot where I'd seen the footprints the day before. Rusty followed close, tail low, ears twitching at every sound. He kept glancing at the tree line, growling under his breath. The ground was torn, not like normal tracks. The impressions were too long, too heavy, as if something had dragged itself forward with weight it shouldn't have carried. The prints weren't uniform either, some narrow and sharp, others wide and splayed. Almost human, almost animal, but not either. I crouched low, touching the pressed grass. The soil was damp and cold, even colder than the morning air. A shiver crawled up my arm. I stared into the woods. The trees loomed like soldiers, tall and silent, their branches knit together to form a wall of darkness. Even in full daylight, the shadows inside looked thick, unnatural, as if light refused to enter. I should have stayed back. I knew that. The rules were clear, but something inside me pulled forward, curiosity gnawing at my fear. I stopped at the fence line, my hand gripping the old wood rail. Beyond this point was the tree line, the boundary. That's when I thought of him, my grandfather, standing just where I was now, watching the same trees with the same dread. He must have spent decades here, fighting them back, holding the line. Alone. Maybe that was my fate too. I rested my forehead against the fence post, letting out a shaky breath. Back in the city, things had been different. Small apartment, white walls, dead-end job in an office where nobody knew anyone's name. I was there for years, surrounded by people, yet I'd never felt more alone. Every day I walked streets lined with neon and noise, but it all felt hollow, like I was only pretending to live. The farm was different. Even as a kid, I felt alive here, soil under my fingernails, sunburn on my neck, animals that looked at me like they knew me. I never admitted it to anyone, but I hated going back to the city when summer ended. I belonged here, and maybe that's why he left it to me. Not to my father, not to anyone else. Me. I lifted my head, staring into the forest again. The shadows shifted. For one terrifying moment, I thought I saw movement deep between the trunks. Tall shapes, just out of focus, watching me. Rusty snarled, fur bristling. I stumbled back from the fence, nearly tripping over my boots. My heart pounded, my palms slick with sweat. I blinked hard, and the shapes were gone. Just trees, just silence, but I didn't believe it. The farm was different. Even as a kid, I felt alive here. Soil under my fingernails, sunburn on my neck, animals that looked at me like they knew me. I never admitted it to anyone, but I hated going back to the city when summer ended. I belonged here, and maybe that's why he left it to me. Not to my father, not to anyone else. Me. I lifted my head, staring into the forest again. The shadows shifted. For one terrifying moment, I thought I saw movement deep between the trunks. Tall shapes, just out of focus, watching me. Rusty snarled, fur bristling. I stumbled back from the fence, nearly tripping over my boots. My heart pounded, my palms slick with sweat. I blinked hard, and the shapes were gone. Just trees, just silence, but I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the day on edge, fixing the roof, mending a gate, carrying hay to the loft. It all blurred together. Every sound from the woods made me freeze. A crow cawing, branches snapping, the sigh of wind through leaves. Each one made my pulse race. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked the perimeter of the property, Rusty close at my side. Every so often I found more signs, grass pressed flat, bark scraped raw, fence posts leaning as if something heavy had leaned against them. The woods weren't just close, they were pressing in. When the sun dipped again, painting the horizon in blood-red streaks, I felt dread settle over me like a heavy coat. Another night was coming, another round of waiting. Back in the kitchen, I opened the notebook again. The rules stared back at me. 3 sentences, sharp and permanent, carved into my mind. I whispered them aloud like a prayer. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. My voice trembled. Rusty whimpered, resting his head on my lap. Outside, the last light drained from the sky. The forest became a wall of black. And in the darkness, I thought I saw them again, shapes moving between the trees, waiting for the night to fall. The sun went down too quickly. One moment the sky burned red and gold, the next it was swallowed whole by a wall of black. Shadows stretched across the fields until they became one with the forest, and the farm was left stranded in the dark. I lit every lantern I could find, their small flames casting halos that barely pushed against the night. Rusty paced from room to room, whining at the doors, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I forced down a can of beans, though every bite tasted like ash. My hands shook as I washed the plate, each clink against the sink making me flinch. When I finally sat down in the living room, the notebook lay heavy in my lap. I read the rules again, my lips whispering the words without sound. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. My stomach twisted. The first one, I had already broken. The second, I had nearly failed. Only the third still stood intact. But the night was long. It started with the animals again. The cattle shifted in their stalls, low moos rumbling like thunder. Chickens fluttered and clucked, restless. Rusty barked at nothing, his tail stiff, his eyes locked on the front door. I checked the clock. 9:15. Too late for chores. Too late for anything. That's when I heard it. Hoofbeats. Soft at first, then heavier. I froze, listening. The cattle shouldn't be out. They were locked in the barn. Rusty growled and darted toward the back door. I followed, my heart hammering. Through the small window in the kitchen door, I could see movement in the yard. Shadows shifting, shapes too large to be human. I grabbed the lantern and stepped out onto the porch. My breath caught. One of the cows stood in the middle of the yard, staring straight at the house. Its eyes glowed pale in the lantern light, reflecting like mirrors. Another stood beside it, and another. The gate to the barn hung open, swinging slowly on broken hinges. I swore under my breath. I hadn't latched it. Rusty barked furiously, straining against my grip. The cattle didn't move, they just stared. I thought of the rule, never feed them after dark. But what about getting them back into the barn? If they stayed out all night, they'd wander into the woods, and then what? I told myself I had no choice. I told myself it was just farm work, nothing more. I stepped off the porch, lantern in hand, Rusty pulling at my side. The cows shifted as I approached, their bodies rippling unnaturally, skin twitching as though something crawled beneath it. My stomach churned. "Easy now," I muttered, forcing calm into my voice. Back inside. I scattered feed from the bucket I'd grabbed on instinct, the dry corn rattling against the dirt. The cows turned their heads sharply at the sound, too sharply. Their necks bent at angles no animals should. Then they moved, not toward the feed, but toward me. Rusty lunged, barking with savage fury, snapping at their legs. The cows stopped, their heads tilting in eerie unison, their glowing eyes fixed on me. My blood turned to ice. I realized too late what I'd done. I'd fed them. After dark. The air thickened. The night grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. The cows' bodies shuddered, their limbs stretching too long, their hooves curling into claws. Their jaws slackened, teeth glinting sharp where flat molars should have been. One let out a low moo that cracked halfway into a guttural, human-like groan. Another bent its head back until its spine popped, staring at me upside down with glowing eyes. Rusty snapped and snarled, but even he backed away, his growls breaking into whimpers. I staggered back toward the porch, my lantern trembling in my grip. The cattle followed, slow and deliberate, their bodies twisting, reshaping, becoming things that no longer belonged to this earth. The notebook's first rule screamed in my mind, louder than the pounding of my heart. Never feed them after dark. Never feed them after dark. I had broken it, and now I was paying the price. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and throwing the bolt. Rusty pressed against me, barking wildly, teeth bared at the wood as the creatures outside closed in. The porch creaked under their weight. The windows rattled as they pressed against the glass. Their groans echoed around the house, deep and broken, vibrating through the floorboards. The lantern flickered, sputtering in my hand. Shadows danced across the walls, bending and stretching into monstrous shapes. Then came the sound, sharp, deliberate, whistling. Not from the woods, not from the porch, from every side of the house at once. The creatures outside groaned and shifted, their glowing eyes burning through the glass. Rusty whimpered, tail between his legs, but still growled through his fear. I pressed my back against the door, clutching the notebook like it could save me. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, raw and desperate. "Promise me you'll follow the rules." But I had failed, and now the rules weren't protecting me anymore. The walls shook. The porch groaned under their weight. Every window rattled in its frame as the creatures pressed closer, their breaths fogging the glass. Rusty barked, savage and terrified, then darted behind me, his tail pressed tight to his belly. He wanted to fight, but whatever stood outside was bigger, stronger, older than anything he understood. The groans outside grew louder, warping into something unnatural. A cow's low bellow bent upward into a high-pitched wail, sharp and almost human. Another followed, its voice cracking, splitting into two sounds at once, as if two throats fought to speak from the same mouth. I staggered back, clutching the lantern and the notebook. My pulse thundered in my ears. Through the front window, pale eyes glowed. At first I thought there were only two, but then another pair opened above them, higher, wider, unblinking. A second set of eyes where no creature's head should be. The silhouette shifted. What had been a cow's body stretched upward, spine cracking like timber. Its legs bent backward, joints snapping and reforming. Skin sagged and split, revealing muscle that twisted like rope. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Another shadow slammed against the side of the house. The boards shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. The groan that followed sounded like a man drowning, gurgling, choking, and then laughing. Rusty whimpered, pressing his head against my leg. His entire body trembled, but he never looked away from the window. I backed down the hallway, every step slow, deliberate. The lantern's flame flickered, casting long, broken shadows across the walls. My grandfather's words thundered in my mind. "If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn." But I wasn't in the barn. I was in the house, and the house wasn't built for this. The whistling started again, weaving through the sounds of claws and hooves. It wasn't distant anymore. It wasn't even outside. It seemed to slither through the walls, the tune vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. I pressed my back against the kitchen counter, clutching the lantern with white knuckles. The window above the sink darkened. A shape leaned close, its breath frosting the glass. Then an eye, too large, too bright, staring through me. Its pupils stretched vertically, glowing like molten metal. I staggered back, knocking over a chair. Rusty snarled, barking until his throat rattled, but the eye didn't blink. It pressed closer, filling the window until cracks spiderwebbed through the glass. "No," I whispered. My voice shook. "No, no, no." The window shattered. Glass exploded inward, shards scattering across the counter and floor. Rusty lunged forward, snapping at the air, as a long, twisted limb slid inside. Not a hoof, not a hand, something between, ending in too many fingers, too many nails, scraping the wood as it searched blindly for me. I grabbed Rusty by the collar, yanking him back as the thing's arm groped deeper into the kitchen. The smell hit me next. Rot, blood, damp hay turned sour. My stomach lurched. The whistling rose, piercing, so loud it rattled my teeth. Another crash shook the house. The front door groaned, hinges straining under the weight pressing against it. Boards cracked. A low growl rolled through the air, deeper than thunder. Rusty barked until his voice broke, but even he began to backpedal, tail tucked, eyes wide with terror. I stumbled into the hallway, dragging him with me, lantern swinging wildly. Shadows leapt across the walls, twisted and distorted like the creatures themselves. The notebook throbbed in my pocket, as if alive, its words pounding against my skull. Never feed them after dark. I had broken it, and now they were breaking in. A loud crack split the night. The front door's wood splintered, shards snapping away as claws punched through. Fingers, long, pale, jointed wrong, curled around the frame. Rusty howled, his voice raw, desperate, as the door shuddered again, one hinge snapping loose. I stumbled backward, deeper into the house. There was nowhere left to go. No barn, no safe place. Only thin walls and the memory of my grandfather's warning. The lantern flickered once, twice, then sputtered out. Darkness swallowed everything, and in that suffocating dark, the door finally gave way. The front door crashed inward, wood splintering like bones. The sound shook the house, echoing through the empty halls. Rusty lunged forward, barking with desperate fury, then bolted back, whining, pressing himself against my leg. But nothing came through. The doorway yawned open into darkness. The night outside hung heavy, a wall of black too thick for the lantern's fading glow. I held my breath. My chest ached with the silence that followed. It was worse than the crash, worse than the rattling doorknob, worse than the whistling. Silence meant waiting. Silence meant they were here. Rusty growled, low and steady, his gaze locked on the shattered frame. His hackles bristled, his body shook. Then came the sound. Not footsteps, not hooves, something softer. A drag, like fabric brushing across the floor. A sigh, almost human, leaking through the hall. I backed away, lantern shaking in my hand, shadows stretching and snapping against the walls. The air grew colder. The smell of rot and damp hay filled the house. Every breath scraped against my throat. Rusty whimpered. His nails clicked against the floorboards as he backed up with me, both of us retreating deeper into the house. Something moved in the doorway, a shape, tall, too tall. Its shoulders hunched, its head scraping the frame. For one sickening moment, I thought I saw its eyes, white, gleaming. But then the lantern flickered and the shape melted back into the dark. "Stay back," I whispered, though my voice was paper thin. "Stay away." The answer was a whistle. Soft, deliberate, curling through the hallway like smoke. The same tune as always, but slower this time. Patient. I pressed my back against the wall, the notebook digging into my ribs through my jacket. The rules pulsed in my skull. Do not look into their eyes. I closed mine, tight. The whistle drifted closer, louder. A second note joined, out of tune, broken, like two voices whistling at once. My skin crawled. Rusty barked suddenly, snapping me back. His teeth flashed, his body rigid, but he barked at nothing, at empty air in the center of the hallway. Then I saw it too. Not a body, not a creature. A shadow, darker than the rest, peeling itself away from the wall. It stretched, long and thin, its arms dragging against the floorboards. I stumbled sideways, clutching the lantern, though its flame sputtered low. The shadow moved with me. No footsteps, no sound but that endless, circling whistle. "Grandpa," I whispered, the words spilling out without thought. "What did you leave me?" The shadow paused. Its head tilted sharply, like it had heard me. Then it leaned closer, its face, or what should have been a face, pressing into the light. There were no features, just darkness. But in that darkness, something gleamed. Eyes, white, too wide, too bright. I shut mine again. My breath tore out in quick gasps. Rusty whined, his nails scrabbling against the floor. The whistle stopped. For a heartbeat, the silence screamed. Then came a knock. Not on the door this time, on the wall. 3 sharp raps from the inside. My blood turned to ice. I staggered backward into the kitchen, knocking over a chair. Rusty barked until his throat cracked. The knocks followed, walls, floor, ceiling. Too many, all around me. Do not look into their eyes. The notebook burned in my pocket, words carved into my bones. I pressed my palms against my ears, shaking, refusing to open my eyes, refusing to let them in. The cold deepened. My breath fogged in the air. Rusty's fur bristled as he circled me, growling at shadows I couldn't see. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it ended. The air stilled, the cold lifted. The house fell silent, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I opened my eyes. The doorway was empty. The walls were still. The only sign of anything wrong was the broken doorframe, splintered wide. Rusty sat trembling beside me, ears back, eyes locked on the dark outside. They hadn't come in, not fully, not yet, but they had been here, visitors, testing me, watching, waiting, and I knew, deep in my bones, that next time they wouldn't stop at the threshold. Morning came like a mercy I didn't deserve. The doorway was still splintered, the floor glittered with glass, and the house smelled faintly of rot that daylight couldn't wash away. Rusty wouldn't leave my side. He followed me room to room, head low, eyes fixed on every shadow, as if the dark might spring back to life. I boarded the door as best I could, with scrap wood from the shed. Every hammer strike rang too loud in the silence. When I finally stepped into the yard, the world felt wrong, too still, too watchful. The fields gleamed with dew. The forest stared back like a shut eye. That's when I heard the barn. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. No lowing, no shuffling hooves. No restless clucks, just a hush that made the hairs on my arms rise. Rusty's ears pricked. A low growl unspooled in his throat. I crossed the yard slowly, boots sinking in soft ground. The big red door hung slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. A shard of wood lay like a broken tooth where the latch used to be. I swallowed and nudged the door wider. The smell hit first. Damp straw, old blood, something sour that turned my stomach. Dust motes floated in a blade of sunlight cutting through the loft slats. It should have comforted me, that beam of day slicing the dark. It didn't. "Easy," I whispered to Rusty. He pressed against my leg, tail tucked, but he came with me. At first glance, everything looked normal. Tack hung from pegs, empty wheelbarrow by the wall, bales stacked neatly in the far corner. I stepped to the nearest stall. The cow inside stared back. Its eyes reflected the light in a way that wasn't right. Too flat, too silver, like two coins pressed into its skull. It didn't blink. Its breathing came slow and damp, a wet rattle that made me think of the hospital, of machines keeping breath where breath didn't belong. "Hey girl," I murmured. My voice sounded like it didn't belong to me. "You're all right." The cow tilted its head, not much, just enough for something in its neck to click. I stepped back. In the next stall, a second cow stood too still. Its muzzle twitched. A thread of saliva stretched and didn't break. Flies circled and didn't land. The chickens on the far roost huddled together, necks craned in the same direction, as if watching an invisible figure walk the center aisle. "Grandpa?" I said before I could stop myself, the word torn out like a splinter. The barn answered with a groan. Old wood settling, or something heavier shifting its weight. I checked the gate bolts one by one, hands shaking. Each latch was twisted, as if giant fingers had tested them and decided to be merciful. Mercy, I realized, had a different meaning out here. Mercy meant not yet. We retreated to the doorway. The fields glittered innocently. The forest smoldered in shadow even at noon. I thought about burning the barn down. I thought about running to the truck and never looking back. But the keys were my grandfather's, and the fuel was his, and the land, God help me, was mine. I spent the rest of the day stringing new wire on the fences, double bolting every gate, propping a pitchfork and a shovel by the back door like talismans. I set a lantern on each windowsill and checked the matches twice. Rusty dozed with one eye open. When the sun tipped, my hands began to shake again. Dusk bled into the yard. The barn darkened first, turning from red to rust to a bruise on the world. Something fluttered in the loft window. Just a curtain of cobwebs, I told myself. Just wind. Then the sound came. A single hoofbeat, then another. Not the quick chatter of panic, but the deliberate thud of something moving with purpose. "Stay," I told Rusty, but he didn't listen. He was already moving, pacing the threshold, torn between fear and loyalty. I grabbed the lantern and followed. The barn door breathed when I touched it, swelling inward, then easing back, as if the building itself had lungs. The lantern flame jittered over the wood. I pushed the door open and let the light fall into the aisle. "Easy," I said again, to the animals or to myself, I wasn't sure. Silence settled like dust. Then from the loft, a slow drag. Straw whispering against wood. The sound snaked down the ladder, came to rest above my head. I lifted the lantern. "Who's there?" My voice broke on the last word. The loft stared back. Shadows, bales, a coil of rope, the dark between slats. Then the whistling began. It didn't come from outside. It didn't come from the house. It poured down from the rafters, the tune so soft and perfectly formed, it felt like a needle stitching through my skin. My eyes burned. I blinked hard, and for a heartbeat I saw shapes walking between the beams, long-limbed, bending where joints shouldn't bend, their heads cocked with animal patience. The cow in the first stall exhaled. The breath came out wrong, wet and warm and close to words. The second cow turned its head all the way to the lantern, slow and dreamy, eyes reflecting 2 points of fire. The chickens lifted together, like a single creature in many bodies, and pressed themselves against the wire. "Back," I told Rusty, and he didn't. He crouched, teeth bared, a growl boiling up from his chest so low it vibrated the boards. The whistling changed. The notes leaned into one another, sour and curious. In the rafters, something matched the lantern's sway, moving when I moved, still when I stilled. "Grandpa," I whispered, "what did you fight here?" The answer was a scrape, inches from my ear. A beam flexed above me. Dust sifted down, cold against my neck. I took one step back. The lantern hissed. A hand, or something that wanted to be a hand, slid down the support post beside the ladder. Too many joints, nails that weren't nails. It stopped just above my shoulder and hung there, tasting the heat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't call out. The rules beat in my skull until they were all I was. Never feed them after dark. If you hear whistling, stay inside the barn. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. There was no tree line here to save me. The hand withdrew. The whistling giggled, just a little hitch of a note, delighted, and then the loft went quiet again. Behind me, a stall latch lifted, on its own. Metal on metal, too careful, too slow. The gate eased open. The cow inside stepped forward, legs moving like a puppet's, knees bending both ways. It turned its head toward me, jaw slack, and something clicked in the hinge of its mouth. "Back," I said, finally finding my legs. I moved down the aisle, dragging the lantern's light with me. The chickens pressed so hard against the wire that their beaks poked through, opening and closing soundlessly. The second stall door rattled. A third. The far end of the barn was darker. Older. A place I hadn't cleaned yet, a wall half hidden behind tools and an old grain bin. As I neared it, the whistling softened, as if inviting me closer, as if the tune knew the way better than I did. Rusty darted ahead, nose to the floor, then to the wall. He pawed at the boards, frantic, whining high in his throat. His claws caught on something, metal. He looked back at me, eyes bright, then pawed harder. "What is it, boy?" My voice was a thread. He scraped away straw and years of dust to reveal a small iron ring set flush into the plank. Old, stained, hidden. The whistling above us dipped into a low, pleased note. I stared at the ring, at the wall, at the bales stacked to either side as if framing a doorway that didn't exist. My hand closed around the iron before I'd decided to move. It was cold, colder than the air, colder than the dew that morning. I pulled. At first, nothing. Then a groan rolled through the barn, wood conceding to old secrets. The plank lifted. A seam appeared where there hadn't been one, a narrow door yawning open into a black that swallowed the lantern's light. Behind me, hooves clattered. The stall gates opened, 1, 2, 3, metal tongues lifting like obedient servants. The chickens hissed, a sound I didn't know chickens could make. The cow nearest me took another step, its shadow doubling and then tripling as if something else inside it was trying to climb out. "Inside," I told Rusty, and he leapt without hesitation, vanishing into the dark behind the hidden door. The whistling above us dropped to a single long note. I looked back down the aisle. They stood there, my animals and not my animals, filling the passage with bent legs and too wide eyes, bodies trembling like bowstrings. Something bigger moved in the loft, so heavy the beams sang. I slipped through the opening and pulled the plank down just as a long limb swept the air where my head had been. The door thudded shut. Darkness swallowed me whole. The whistling cut off. For one heartbeat, the barn was silent. Then something exhaled on the other side of the wall, slow and delighted, and the hidden room around me answered with its own breath, full of oil and leather and old iron, as if the secrets I'd stumbled into had been waiting for me all along. The hidden door slammed shut behind me, sealing Rusty and me in complete darkness. My lantern sputtered once, then steadied, casting a small, trembling halo of light around the cramped space. The air was heavy, thick with dust and oil. I coughed, waving my hand in front of my face. Rusty pressed against my leg, trembling, but at least here he wasn't growling. He was quiet, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the walls. I raised the lantern higher. It wasn't just a room, it was a bunker. Wooden shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of objects I couldn't immediately name. Old iron traps, lengths of heavy chain, bundles of herbs tied with twine. Jars filled with dark liquid, each one with something floating inside. Teeth, bones, feathers, eyes that looked too human to be here. A workbench stretched across the far wall. Tools hung above it, knives with worn handles, hammers stained black, a sickle polished to a cruel edge. The wood of the bench was scarred, cut into with dozens of lines. Some from the tools, some from something clawing against it. On the bench itself sat a lantern already lit, its flame steady despite the stale air. Beside it lay a thick, leather-bound book. I stepped closer, every nerve screaming to turn back, to close the door and pretend this didn't exist. But my grandfather's voice whispered in my memory, "The rules keep us safe." My hand shook as I touched the cover. The leather was old, cracked, almost sticky. When I opened it, the pages crackled like brittle leaves. It wasn't a diary, it was a record. The first page was dated more than 50 years ago. His handwriting was strong then, neat and deliberate. The first time they came, I thought it was foxes in the coop. Then I saw their eyes at the tree line. Not foxes, never foxes. The rules were given to me the same way I give them now, to survive. I swallowed hard and turned the page. There were drawings, crude sketches in pencil and ink. Some looked like cattle, but wrong. Too many joints, teeth where they shouldn't be. Others were tall, thin figures with wide, white eyes, their mouths frozen in a whistle. Beneath each sketch was a note. Don't feed, don't follow, never answer. The further I read, the more frantic the writing became. He described nights of whistling that lasted until dawn. He wrote about cattle that changed when fed after dark, about chickens that stopped clucking and began to mimic voices. They test the boundaries, one entry read. They never stop. They push against the walls of the house, the fences, the barn. They look for weakness. One mistake is enough. One mistake, and they'll take everything. My stomach twisted. My mistake was already made. Rusty whined, pawing at the floor. His nails scraped against something metallic. I lifted the lantern lower. A box sat under the workbench, iron-banded, the lock hanging broken. Inside lay weapons, if you could call them that. A rusted shotgun with shells wrapped in cloth, a hatchet stained dark with use, a long chain with hooks at the ends. There were also smaller things, bundles of herbs, little stone carvings etched with symbols I didn't recognize, and a pouch of salt tied tight. I lifted the pouch, feeling the rough grains inside. Protection. That much I understood. My grandfather hadn't just fought with his hands. He had fought with whatever scraps of magic or faith he could gather. I turned back to the journal. The later entries shook with desperation. They took a calf. Gone before dawn, not a trace. I heard it calling in the woods, but I didn't follow, never follow. I hear my wife's voice outside sometimes. I know it's not her, she's been gone 10 years. But still, I hear her. They want me to open the door. I don't have much time left. If Jack is the one to inherit this place, he must know. He must follow the rules. If he breaks them, the land will claim him. The land always claims its keeper. I slammed the book shut, breath ragged. Rusty whined again, ears twitching toward the wall. I froze. The whistling had stopped, but another sound replaced it. Scratching. Slow, deliberate, against the wood outside. Something was dragging its nails, or claws, across the barn wall, searching. The lantern flickered. Shadows swelled, bending across the shelves, stretching longer than they should. Rusty growled low, teeth flashing. I shoved the book into my jacket and grabbed the shotgun. It was old, the barrel pitted, but it was something. I loaded the shells with shaking hands, the click echoing in the small space. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice breaking, What did you leave me?" As if in answer, the scratching stopped. Silence, then 3 slow knocks against the hidden door. Rusty barked, snapping at the wood. My heart seized. They knew exactly where I was. The knocks came again, louder. The door rattled on its hinges. I clutched the shotgun tight, the journal heavy against my chest. My grandfather had fought them all his life. Now it was my turn. The knocks ceased. The silence returned. But I knew, with a certainty that made my blood run cold, this wasn't over. The barn hadn't just been holding animals, it had been holding secrets. And now those secrets were mine to carry. The knocks stopped. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, someone else's, right against my ear. I eased the shotgun to my shoulder and waited. Rusty pressed to my calf, trembling but ready, eyes bright in the lantern's glow. The hidden room's air tasted like iron and dust. My grandfather's journal thudded against my ribs with every breath, as if reminding me I wasn't the first to stand here, wondering if the next sound meant I'd die. Then the barn spoke. Not with voices, not yet, but with wood. A beam bowed somewhere above us. A stall latch clanged open. Hooves skittered. A second latch, a third. The animals were being loosed, one by one, and not by any hand I wanted to meet. I swallowed and grabbed what I could carry. The pouch of salt, the old hatchet, 3 little stone carvings from the shelf, each scored with a symbol I didn't recognize, and the chain with hooks coiled like a sleeping snake. I slung the chain over my shoulder, cinched the salt to my belt, and wedged the carvings into my jacket pocket alongside the journal. "Stay," I whispered to Rusty. He didn't. He never did. He was already at the door, muscles tight, head low, waiting for me to decide whether we would live or not. I lifted the latch and cracked the hidden door. Cold air nosed in, smelling of straw turned sour. The lantern's light seeped through the seam and painted a thin bruise across the barn floor. I listened. The faint hiss of breath where breath shouldn't be, the delicate scrape of nails testing wood, and, threading between it all, the soft ghost of a tune, whistled under the breath, as if someone waited to see whether I'd notice. I pushed the door wider and stepped out. The barn was dim as a church at midnight. My lantern drew timid circles on the boards. In the nearest stall, a cow stood too close to the gate, still and eager, as if it had been listening at the crack. Its eyes reflected the flame in 2 cold coins. Behind it, something shifted in shadow, too tall to be a cow, too thin to be a man. The shape turned its face toward the light, and the light bent around it. I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the floor, on the path my lantern cut. The rules beat steady. Don't feed. Stay inside the barn when you hear whistling. Don't look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. The last rule wasn't for here, not yet, but it marched with the others like a drumline. "I'm not yours," I said to the dark. "Not tonight." I tossed a pinch of salt down the aisle. The air twitched. It wasn't much, a shiver through the boards, the barest hitch in the whistling. But something in the barn disliked what I'd done. Rusty's ears went up. I tossed another pinch, then another, tracing a rough line between me and the stalls. The whistling dimmed, as if the wall of sound had found a seam it couldn't pass. From the loft, a giggle of notes, amused, curious. The beam above us gave a warning groan. "Move," I breathed. We slipped down the aisle. I latched 2 loose gates and shouldered a third that had warped in its frame. The shotgun's weight was a comfort. The chain's iron kissed my back each time I turned. At the big barn door, I paused and set the lantern down. I lifted the pouch of salt, took a breath, and snapped my wrist in a quick half-circle on the threshold. A crude crescent on the floorboards. The air cooled, then stilled, as if the barn had inhaled and held it. "Please work," I whispered to whatever my grandfather had trusted more than his own strength. Then I pulled the door wide and stepped into the night. The yard was silvered with moonlight. The farmhouse sat hunched and black across the way, a boarded mouth and blind windows, while the forest beyond the field rose like a wall. The tree line drank the light and gave nothing back. Rusty darted ahead, stopped, then looked back with a low bark that sounded like a question. Where? I didn't answer. I didn't know. The whistling had bled outside, softer here, as if it lived in the boards, and had to learn new lungs to sing in the open air. A shape glided along the side of the barn, tall, bone-silent. I didn't chase. I bent, drew a crude circle of salt around my boots, and scattered a handful in Rusty's fur. He sneezed, shook, then pressed his shoulder to my shin, as if understanding, as if the dog's body remembered old rites men had forgotten. The whistling paused, a beat of quiet. Then the tune resumed from farther left, taunting. Another shape moved, then another, deeper in the yard. They wanted me out and moving, wanted me to follow, to break whatever thin line the salt and the threshold had drawn. I didn't. I backed toward the house in small steps, keeping the barn at my shoulder. That's when the generator coughed and died. It had been humming all along, low, dependable, a noise so steady I hadn't noticed it until it stopped. The yard fell into a deeper quiet, the kind that makes you hear your blood. The farmhouse winked out, every lantern gone. Even the moonlight seemed to falter. Beside me, the barn door eased an inch on its own hinges. Not in or out, just enough to breathe. A sound rose from the field, not whistling this time. Hooves, dozens of them. But the rhythm was wrong. 4 beats, then 3, then 4 again, like legs forgetting their count. The herd, what was left of it, what wore it, was coming up from the pasture. "House," I said, and we ran. We didn't sprint. There's no sprinting in a yard where the night trips you. We moved in a quick, careful glide, skirting the fence, the salt pouch bumping my hip. The chain clinked a warning against my back. The hooves drew nearer, and with them came a smell I had already come to know. Wet hay, opened earth, the sweet rot of something that had been alive too long. Halfway to the porch, a shape detached from the barn's shadow and strode into our path. It had a man's height, a man's reach, the suggestion of a man's shoulders, but its head tilted too far, listening like a deer, and where its face ought to have been, there was only a blank of darkness pricked with 2 pale points where eyes might bloom. I didn't look at the points. I dropped a line of salt between us instead. The shape stopped. Not because it couldn't cross, but because it wanted to see what I would do next. The whistling suggested a single high note, like a finger tracing a glass. "Not yours," I said again, because saying it kept me from thinking. We edged around the line. The shape kept pace on the other side, always the same distance away, always with the head cocked as if considering a specimen. The hooves grew loud enough to vibrate the dirt. Rusty's lips peeled back from his teeth. We hit the steps. The porch boards answered with familiar groans. I spun, flung a broad arc of salt across the front edge, and kicked the door open with my boot. Inside, the air was stale, and broken glass crunched underfoot, but the house was ours. I hauled Rusty across the threshold, then stooped to lay a thick white band of salt in the jam. The tune outside faltered. The tall shape had stopped at the bottom step, staring, not at me, but at the line. In its stillness, it seemed to have weight, as if the night itself sagged to accommodate it. Slowly, almost tenderly, it raised one hand. Long fingers reached toward the salt like a child tasting rain. Its touch never came. Something screamed in the field. It wasn't an animal scream, though it wore one like a cloak. It was bigger and older, a tearing wail that dragged nails down the inside of my skull. The herd had reached the yard. I felt their steps thud through the floorboards, saw the window panes quiver in their frames. The shape at the steps turned its head toward the sound, as if annoyed, as if this hunt were not proceeding with the care it preferred. Then it stepped backward and dissolved into shadow, the way breath fades from a mirror. Immediately, and as if it had never been. The house trembled as something heavy rammed a wall. A window rattled. The tune restarted outside from 3 places at once, thin and hungry. The herd's rhythm faltered, then righted, then faltered again, legs arguing with the bodies that carried them. I moved on instinct. I tore the journal from my jacket, and flipped with shaking fingers to the page I'd felt under my thumb all night. Half a sketch, half a prayer. My grandfather had drawn a crude map of the yard, porch, barn, well, fence, and a set of marks like stitches laid between the house and the barn. "Stitch the night in iron," he'd written. "They do not like seams." I dropped the book, seized the chain from my shoulder and ran. "Stay!" I shouted, and this time Rusty obeyed. He planted himself in the doorway, body low, a single warning bark punching the dark. I leapt from the porch, boots slamming dirt. The nearest hooves broke rhythm, turning toward me. I swung the chain in a clattering arc and slammed its hooked end into the ground, then dragged it, scoring a gleaming line from the porch post to the corner of the house. Sparks spat. The iron sang a dull note. The whistling wavered. The shapes wavered with it. I yanked the chain up and ran for the well, slashing another line through the yard, crossing the first. A seam, a stitch, a clumsy surgeon sewing up a wound he couldn't see. Something lunged from the side. I didn't look at its face. I saw only its shadow. Long arms, too many joints, a head bent as if listening to my pulse. I whipped the chain and it hit with a wet clang. The shadow jerked back. The tune snapped to a lower key, annoyed. "Come on!" I yelled, and I wasn't sure if I was shouting at the thing, or the night, or myself. "Come on then!" We made the last stitch between the well and the barn's corner. The air tightened. The yard seemed to shrink to a smaller room. The herd balked at the invisible crosshatch I'd carved. Several bodies shied and stumbled. Hooves hammered, then shuffled back. The whistling frayed at the edges, no longer one sure voice, but a chorus of thin breaths. From the trees, something answered. A second whistle. Lower, older. It rolled from the tree line like fog and gathered the others to it, all the little tunes marching toward a single melody that made the hair lift along my arms. They were calling me to the edge. The third rule pulsed once, white hot. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. I backed toward the porch, chain dragging, lungs burning. The melody swelled. Rusty barked and barked, each sound sharp as a nail. I made the final step up and froze. A shape stood in the doorway behind Rusty. Not tall, not thin, familiar. My grandfather. Hat brim low, work jacket, the posture I knew as well as my own. He looked at me with eyes that shone the way oil shines on water. "Jack," he said softly, "you're stitching wrong. You'll leave a gap." My mouth went dry. The journal lay open on the floor, pages shivering in a draft. Rusty didn't move. He stared at the man in the doorway and made a sound I'd never heard from him, half growl, half plea. I held the chain tighter. I didn't look into the eyes. I looked at the boots, at the shadow the figure didn't cast, at the way the voice carried without breath. "Grandpa," I said, not trusting my throat. "Come to the tree line," he murmured, so gently it almost felt like mercy. "I'll show you how." Behind him, through the blown door, the forest waited, tall, black, patient. White points bloomed between the trunks, the way stars do when clouds thin. I shut my eyes. The chain burned my palms. "Not yours," I said, "not tonight." The tune at the trees rose, all the little whistles braided into one. The floor trembled, the glass hummed, and something heavy settled its weight against the house, as if bracing to press. I opened my eyes to keep from seeing what my mind would invent. The figure of my grandfather smiled, slow and wrong. "Then we'll come to you," he said. The porch boards bowed under a new weight behind me. Rusty whirled, teeth bared. The night drew a breath, and the hunt began again. The night pressed against the house like a living thing. The porch groaned under footsteps that weren't footsteps, boards bowing under weight that shifted too smoothly to belong to hooves or boots. Rusty barked until his throat cracked, then dropped into a growl so low it rattled through the floorboards. I pressed my back to the wall, the shotgun slick in my hands, the journal heavy in my pocket. The false image of my grandfather still hovered in my mind, his voice coaxing, his eyes too bright, too empty. I reminded myself again and again, not him, never him. The first blow hit the siding, a sharp crack, wood splintering. Then another, lower down. Then a third, directly against the window pane. The glass trembled but held. The house shuddered as if bracing itself. Rusty darted to the front room, barking wildly. I followed, lantern swinging. My stomach dropped. Lines of pale cracks spiderwebbed across the glass, each one blooming from a single point. Something had pressed its face against the window, and then it smeared. Dark streaks, thick and wet, dragged down the glass like paint. The smell hit me next. Copper and rot, the stench of blood long spilled but still warm. "God," I whispered. Rusty snarled, his teeth snapping at the window as if he could tear through the glass to reach whatever waited outside. His breath fogged against the pane, mixing with the streaks. Then the whistle started again. Not distant, not soft, direct. It came from just beyond the glass, muffled but perfect, each note vibrating through the blood-stained pane. I stumbled back. Don't look into their eyes. The rule pounded in my skull, a drum I couldn't silence. I forced myself to look away, but curiosity itched under my skin like fire. The whistle broke, shifted. Another tune began, one I knew too well. My mother's lullaby. My chest seized. I hadn't heard it in years, not since childhood. Rusty whimpered, looking up at me. The sound outside twisted, stretched, but the melody remained. My knees nearly buckled. "They know me," I whispered. "They know." The window pane bulged inward, wood creaking as something leaned harder against it. A single crack ran the full length of the glass. "Move!" I shouted, dragging Rusty by the collar. We ran down the hallway just as the window shattered behind us, glass exploding across the room in a glittering rain. The whistle poured into the house like smoke. The pounding began then. Not just on one wall, on all of them. The north side first, then the back, then the south. Fists, hooves, claws, I couldn't tell. Every blow rattled dust from the ceiling, sent dishes trembling in their cabinets. I pressed my back to the kitchen counter, shotgun raised, eyes darting from window to window. Shadows shifted outside, tall and thin, bending wrong. I saw shapes at the tree line, white points of eyes gleaming between trunks. Too many, far too many. The third rule pulsed again. Do not look into their eyes when they stand at the tree line. I squeezed mine shut, but even in the dark I saw them, burned into my eyelids, watching, waiting. A slam shook the back door. The bolt bent, nails tearing free. Rusty lunged, barking, hackles raised. "No!" I dragged him back, clutching his fur. "Not yet!" Another crash. The hinges screamed. Blood seeped under the doorframe, black in the lantern light, pooling across the tiles. Rusty snapped at it, teeth flashing, but I yanked him away before he touched it. The puddle spread faster than any liquid should, climbing the grout, soaking into the walls. The house bled. I grabbed the pouch of salt, hands shaking, and scattered a thick line across the kitchen doorway. The liquid hissed as it touched, recoiling. Steam rose, sharp and acrid. For a moment, the pounding stopped. Rusty looked at me, eyes wide, chest heaving. He understood. So did they. The whistling rose outside, shriller, angry now. A chorus joined it, dozens of notes weaving into one hideous melody that scraped against my teeth. The walls shivered. Blood seeped higher, dripping from the ceiling, running between the boards. It streaked the wallpaper, drawing symbols I didn't recognize. Circles, eyes, teeth. I clutched the journal and flipped to the marked pages. My grandfather's handwriting was frantic. If they bleed the walls, you must answer with iron. Blood answers blood. The chain. I tore it from my shoulder and swung it wide, the hooks clattering against the tiles. Rusty jumped back, ears flat. I slammed one end into the bleeding wall. The wood screamed. A crack ran up its length, and the blood recoiled, retreating into the seams. Another slam at the back door. This one split the frame. Rusty barked and lunged, his body taut. The whistle cut out. For one heartbeat, the world fell silent. Then came the voice. "Jack!" Not my grandfather this time, my own voice. Perfect but wrong, echoing from just outside the door. "Jack," it said again, softer now, coaxing. "You can't fight us. You're already ours." My stomach twisted. Rusty growled low and sharp. The bolt snapped. The door swung inward an inch, then two. A pale hand slid through the gap, fingers too long, nails scraping the tile. Another hand followed, gripping the frame. I raised the shotgun, breath ragged, heart hammering. Rusty lunged at the hands, teeth snapping. The house groaned as if it were alive, blood streaking every wall, symbols burning crimson in the lantern light. And I realized the rules weren't just warnings. They were bargains, lines my grandfather had kept his whole life, lines I had already broken. Now the bargain was collapsing, and the night wanted me inside it. The back door gaped an inch wider, pale fingers curled on the tiles like white spiders, nails scraping tiny moons into the grout. Rusty hurled himself at them, teeth clacking so close I felt the bite in my own jaw. The hands didn't flinch, they only reached farther. "Jack." My own voice breathed from the dark. "Let us in." The rules hammered through me, too many broken, too late. I swung the iron chain. The hooked end rang against the frame, sparks spitting, and the hands withdrew with a hiss like steam leaving a kettle. The door thudded shut, the split wood knitting itself no more than a child's lie. The house went quiet. Not safe, never safe, but listening. Blood still threaded the wallpaper. Symbols pulsed, circles, eyes, teeth, each line slick, each curve fresh as if the walls themselves were a living wound. The lantern's flame guttered and steadied, throwing the room into a slow pulse. Light, shadow, light. Rusty's chest heaved. He stared at the door, then at me, and whined low, asking a question I couldn't answer. I grabbed the journal with hands that would not stop shaking. Pages fluttered in a frantic heartbeat until my thumb found the place it had searched for all night. An edge thicker than the rest. A page that felt wrong under skin. I pinched it and pulled. A second sheet peeled away from the back cover. A leaf glued there by wax and years. The bond tore with a sigh. Something cold slid down my spine. On the hidden paper, my grandfather's hand was different, tighter. The letters cramped, as if he were writing inside a closet with his breath gone and something pressing its ear to the door. The last rule. The title was cut deep enough to scar the page beneath. If you break a rule, you must finish what I could not. Bind the caller before dawn, or the land will claim you as keeper and feed them from your hands forever. I read it twice, and the words did not change. The ink looked wet. It was not wet. It looked new. It was not new. "Bind the caller," I whispered. Rusty's ears flicked. Outside, somewhere far and near at once, the whistling tried out a note and held it, curious as a blade. I read on. "They send the herd. They send the shades. They send the ones who wear our faces. Do not follow them into the trees. That is the forest's hunger. You must stand your ground where the field meets the wood and stitch the night shut in iron. When the caller steps to the seam, blind his eyes with salt and close his mouth with chain. Do not speak your own name. Do not answer when he uses it. If he answers to yours, he is bound until sunrise." My throat closed. The page vibrated in my fingers with the pounding of my heart. At the bottom, a crude diagram. The porch, the well, the barn, and a line of iron stitches I had already started to carve into the yard. Almost the same as his sketch in part 11, but now with a break at the tree line marked with a small cross. There, scrawled in a shaking hand, SEAM. Beside it, a list that wasn't quite a prayer. Iron chain, salt, voice not your own, if you have one, whistle if you don't. Dog, if he'll stand, they respect what is loyal. I looked at Rusty. He stared back, head tilted, as if the word loyal were a whistle only he could hear. The last line of the page had been pressed so hard the letters cut through. Do not look into his eyes. The house exhaled, wood relaxing, nails loosening in their holes. The blood on the wallpaper cooled from black to a darker black. Outside, the herd's misfit hooves found a rhythm again. The caller tested a new phrase of the melody, distant and near in the same breath, as if walking toward the tree line and toward my door at once. "Bind him," I said, "at the seam." Before dawn, the window glass trembled with a breath I couldn't feel. I stuffed the torn page into my jacket, slung the chain over my shoulder, and tied the salt tight to my belt. The iron's weight steadied me, or drowned me. It didn't matter which. I moved because the paper said move. I breathed because the rules said breathe. At the threshold, I hesitated. "Grandpa," I whispered, not to the thing that wore his hat, but to the man who had bled and stitched and kept these lines for decades. "I'll finish it." The front room's floorboards answered with a soft pop, like a jar unsealing. I set my boot across the salt line and stepped into the night. Moonlight washed the yard to bone. My stitches of iron glinted faintly where I had dragged the chain, a crosshatch of dull scars in the dirt. Beyond them, the field lay like a held breath, and beyond the field, the forest reared up, a black wall pricked with pale points deeper than distance. The whistling stopped. Something stepped from between the trees. I didn't look at its eyes. I looked at its ankles, at the way the grass bent under a weight that belonged to the woods and not to the field. I looked at its hands, long, careful, empty. I looked at its mouth, which I refused to see as a mouth. It was a hole in the night where the tune lived. "Jack," it said, not with my voice, not with my grandfather's, with a voice that sounded like both and neither, braided out of echoes. "Jack, you're stitching wrong. There's a gap. You'll leave a way for us." It stopped where my iron lines met the edge of the field. There, in my grandfather's drawing, was the seam I'd been too terrified to finish. Rusty stood at my knee, fur up, head low, a growl running through him like a wire line. He didn't bark. Dogs don't bark at thunder when they plan to hold the house together with their teeth. "Not mine," I said, because the page told me not to speak my own name. Not tonight. The caller tilted its head, listening for a name I would not give. The points of its eyes were stars through water. The grass at its feet browned where it stood. I set the chain down and took one step forward, then another, until I stood at the seam. The iron lines to either side hummed faintly against my boots. The forest breathed. The field's breath answered. Between them, only me. The caller breathed in. The tune gathered in its throat. I whistled first, a simple note, the one from my grandfather's kettle when the lid rattled, and he said, "Now, boy, now." The one from my mother's lullaby on the one good night I remember, the only notes I had. Not my voice, not my name, just air and shape. The night flinched, the caller's head cocked farther than a neck should turn. Its mouth tightened. The tune it had been preparing fell wrong in its throat and sliced itself on the silence. I didn't wait for it to find a new key. I flung a fist of salt into the air between us. The grains hung like a tiny galaxy and then burst against its face with a sound like rain on hot iron. The caller recoiled, not far, enough. "Come on," I breathed to the dog and the night and the man who had drawn this map. "Help me." I whistled again, off-key, ugly, mine. Rusty matched it with a sound from deep in his chest, not a bark, not a howl, something older that dogs remember when they dream on hot afternoons. The caller faltered. I dragged the chain through the seam. The hooks ploughed a bright, thin line at the edge where field met wood. Sparks skittered. The iron sang a single flat note that made my teeth ache. I planted my boots and pulled. The chain bit earth, then roots, then something under the roots that wasn't soil. The caller stepped forward, testing. The iron line smoked. It stopped. The tune in its throat collapsed to breathe again. "Closer," I said to the fear that had lived in my bones since the hospital. Rusty surged, shoulders brushing my knee. His growl deepened. The line brightened. The air thinned, as if something were being drawn out of it and coiled into the chain. The caller reached a hand toward the seam. The grass at my feet blackened. The iron burned my palms through the leather. The salt stung my eyes. I didn't blink. I didn't look up. "Answer to me," I said, and though I used no name, the words shook like a name does when it matters. "If you want the door open, answer." The caller's mouth widened, tune gathering, all the little whistles behind it drawing breath. Heard, shades, faces they'd borrowed. The forest leaned. The field answered. The chain sang. I lunged. The hooks caught the caller's wrists. Its skin was not skin. It was bark and ice and hunger folded into a shape a mind could tolerate for a moment. The hooks bit anyway. The iron hissed. The tune shattered into 100 bright notes that cut the night like glass and fell around us and kept falling. Rusty leapt and clamped his teeth where a throat should have been. He didn't shake, he held. The way a good dog holds a thing that must not be let go. "Down!" I rasped, and he braced, legs digging trenches into the seam. I hauled the chain higher, wrapping it once, twice around the caller's reaching arms, then over its mouth, crosswise, the links grinding into that hole where the whistle lived. "Answer," I said through my teeth, "to me." It tried to use my grandfather's voice. It tried to use my father's, a voice I hardly remembered. It tried my own again, sweet as lying. The chain ground tighter. The salt burned whiter. The tune whined into a mosquito whir, and then nothing. "Answer," I said a third time, the way the page told me to, the way a prayer repeats until the world replies. Something in the forest screamed, but not the caller. The herd staggered, hooves lost their count. The white points between the trunks went out, then on, then out again like a failing sky. The caller went still. It didn't say my name. It didn't say any name. But its jaw worked against the iron and made a sound like a word that could be mine if I let it. I didn't. I pulled until the chain sang itself hot and bright, and the iron links kissed each other with sparks. Rusty held. The seam held. Dawn did not come. Not yet. The caller strained once, twice, and then, quietly, almost politely, nodded. The chain went cold in my hands. The iron darkened. The hole of a mouth stayed shut. The eyes I would not meet lowered like lamps blown by a careful breath. Behind it, the tree line exhaled through 1,000 leaves. Bound, the page had promised, until sunrise. I didn't know how long that meant. I only knew we had bought it. Rusty let go gently, as if he understood bargains. I wrapped the last of the chain and tied it off with hands that finally stopped shaking because they had no strength left to do even that. My breath clouded the air. The field sighed. The forest listened. "Not yours," I said to whatever would hear me. "Not tonight." The caller bowed its head. Somewhere behind me, in the house that had bled, the symbols on the walls began to dry. The tune that had lived in the glass did not come back to live there. The porch did not groan. Far off, in a place I refused to look, the sky thought about turning grey. I stood with my dog at the seam where my grandfather had stood alone for years. He'd never counted in any ledger, and I understood the last rule wasn't a sentence. It was a job, and until sunrise, it was mine. The caller hung at the seam, bound in iron and silence. Its long limbs twitched against the chain, not in struggle, but in a slow rhythm, like a pendulum keeping time. Rusty sat at my side, chest heaving, ears pressed back. His fur bristled, but his teeth stayed bared. I didn't dare look into its eyes. I kept mine fixed on the ground, on the dull glow of the iron line that hummed under the weight of our bargain. But binding the caller hadn't ended the night. The field still shifted. The herd still moved, broken legs carrying bodies that should not have stood. The forest still breathed with hunger, and the walls of the farmhouse behind me still remembered how to bleed. I checked the sky. It hadn't changed. The moon hung frozen, as if dawn were a story someone had forgotten to tell. The journal's page had said it plain. Bind the caller before dawn. I had done it, but what if dawn never came? Rusty's ears pricked. He whined, low and sharp, and turned his head back toward the house. I followed his gaze. Shadows moved across the porch. Not tall, not thin, human-sized. Familiar shapes. I saw my father's stride, though I hadn't seen him in years. I saw my mother's silhouette, head tilted in the way she used to when I was in trouble. A dozen faces I knew, all of them gone. They didn't whistle. They didn't need to. They only called my name. "Jack," my father's voice said. "Jack, let us in." Rusty barked, snapping at the air. I clenched the chain tighter. "Don't listen," I whispered. The caller shifted. The iron links rattled. A low vibration hummed through the ground, as if it approved of their game. The figures on the porch turned their faces toward me. Their eyes glowed, pale coins in the dark. My mother smiled, lips parting to show too many teeth. My father's jaw unhinged until it cracked. I looked away, fixing my eyes on the dirt, on the dull glint of the chain. My grandfather's rule burned in my mind. Do not look into their eyes. The voices multiplied, spilling across the yard, weaving together in a chant of my name. It rose and fell, louder, closer, until I thought it might crush me. Rusty pressed against my knee, whining, reminding me I wasn't alone. I grabbed a fistful of salt and scattered it across the porch. The figures hissed, flickering, their outlines blurring until they dissolved into smoke. The chant collapsed into silence. For a moment the night stilled. Then the herd answered. Hooves thundered in the pasture, 100 legs breaking into a gallop that had no rhythm, no sense. They slammed against the invisible seam of iron stitches I'd carved earlier. The earth shook, the line glowed faint, then dimmer, then bright again, as if straining under the weight. Rusty snarled, pacing the line. I dropped more salt, scattering it in wide arcs, but I knew it wouldn't hold them all. A scream tore through the night, half animal, half human. The sound scraped the marrow of my bones. One of the cows staggered into the moonlight. Its body twisted, skin peeling, revealing limbs too long, eyes too wide. It collapsed, then lurched up again, as if something inside it refused to let go. I lifted the shotgun and fired. The blast split the night. The creature dropped, its body twitching in the dirt. The herd froze, then they laughed. Not all at once, one low chuckle, another broken giggle, a chorus of human voices leaking from animal throats. My stomach lurched. I reloaded, hands trembling. Rusty barked furiously, darting to the seam. Another shape approached, a horse this time, its legs bending backward, eyes glowing white. It stopped at the iron line, nostrils flaring, breath steaming. I raised the shotgun, my finger tightened on the trigger. But before I could fire, the caller moved. It didn't break its chains. It didn't need to. It only tilted its head back and let out a sound that wasn't a whistle, wasn't a voice, but something between. A pulse that made the air ripple, the ground quiver. The herd answered with silence, perfect silence. Then they stepped back, all at once, melting into the shadows of the field. The laughter died. The air grew still. Rusty whimpered, confused. I didn't lower the gun. The caller bowed its head, chains rattling, bound waiting, and I understood. This wasn't victory, this was endurance. The caller had given the herd back to the dark because I had bound him, but the night itself still pressed, still waited. If I faltered before dawn, if I looked up, if I spoke wrong, everything would pour back through the seam. I clenched the chain tighter. My palms bled where the iron bit through skin. Rusty curled at my feet, growling at the dark. We stood together at the seam. One man, one dog, one chain. Hours, or minutes, dragged by. Time didn't move here. The moon didn't shift. The forest didn't breathe. The caller didn't stir. Only my heartbeat marked the distance. And then, finally, the sky cracked. Not much, just a hint of grey at the horizon, the barest promise of light. The caller shivered. The chain rattled. Its body sagged, no longer tall, no longer strong. The pale points of its eyes dimmed. The whole of its mouth opened once, but no sound came out. The herd screamed once more from the pasture, a single desperate cry, then fell silent. Rusty barked once, sharp and triumphant. The first ray of sunlight broke over the trees. The caller bowed its head. Its body unraveled like smoke, slipping back into the seam of the forest, bound not by me but by dawn itself. The iron chain fell slack in my hands, cold and heavy, only metal again. The tree line exhaled. The night withdrew. I dropped to my knees in the dirt, breath tearing out of me, blood slick on my palms. Rusty pressed against me, tail wagging once, unsure but alive. The sun rose. We had made it. The sun climbed slow, pale and tired, as if it too had fought through the night. The light bled over the fields, soft and grey at first, then brighter, until the shadows broke and the forest shrank back to where it belonged. Rusty lay in the dirt beside me, chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. His muzzle was streaked with salt and blood, but his eyes were clear. When the sunlight touched his fur, his tail wagged once, weak but certain. I dropped the chain. It landed in the dirt with a dull, lifeless clatter. No hum, no heat, just iron again. The seam was empty. The caller was gone, but I knew better than to think it was finished. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle screaming, every joint stiff. My palms bled from the chain. My ears still rang from the whistling that had carved through the night. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to sleep for a week, maybe forever. Instead, I walked. Through the yard, past the barn where the hidden door waited, past the house whose walls still bore faint stains of dried blood. Every step felt borrowed, every breath too loud in the morning quiet. I made it to the porch and leaned against the railing. The boards were cracked where shapes had pressed too hard. Salt still lined the doorway, grains shining in the early light. I pulled the journal from my jacket. The pages were warped with sweat and blood, my grandfather's words smudged where my hands had trembled. I turned to the last page again, the one I'd torn free. The ink glared back at me. Bind the caller before dawn, or the land will claim you. I had bound him. I had lasted until dawn, but I understood now. It hadn't been a one-time trial. It was a job, a calling, a curse. This farm wasn't just land. It was a boundary, a line that needed someone to hold it. My grandfather had held it for decades, and now it was mine. The sun rose higher. The fields glittered with dew, innocent again. The barn groaned as if it had only ever been wood. The forest swayed gently, birds chirping in its branches as if nothing had happened. But I knew. At night, they would return. They always did. They would test me, the way they tested him. They would whistle, scratch, bleed the walls. They would wear faces I longed to see. And if I faltered, if I broke the rules again, they would not stop at the porch. Rusty whined softly, resting his head against my boot. I reached down, stroking the rough fur between his ears. His loyalty had saved me. My grandfather had been right. They respect what is loyal. I guess it's us now, I whispered. The wind sighed through the grass, carrying no answer but its own. I thought of the city I had left behind, the apartment, the job, the streets filled with strangers. I realized I could never go back. Even if I tried, the farm would call me back here. Not out of love, but necessity. This place wasn't mine to escape, it was mine to keep. The last rule wasn't just ink on a hidden page, it was the weight of the land itself. If you break a rule, you must finish what I could not. Grandpa hadn't finished it. Neither had his father or the one before him. It wasn't a task meant to be finished, only carried, until someone else inherited it. I shut the journal and looked out across the fields. The forest loomed at the far edge, tall and black even in daylight. For now it was quiet, but I felt its eyes. Waiting. Patient. Rusty barked once, sharp and defiant, as if to remind them we were still here. I managed to smile. Weak, bitter, but real. The farm was mine. The rules were mine. The burden was mine. And tonight, when the sun fell, it would all begin again. The farmer's last rule. Some inherit houses, some inherit land. I inherited a line in the dirt, a book of rules, and a war that never ends. My grandfather kept the night at bay for decades, alone. Now it is my turn, and I will keep it until someone else has to. Enjoyed the nightmare? Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next story. This is Midnight Jack.